Mick, thanks so much for joining me on this very tragic day in Washington, D.C. For all of our viewers at home, you're in D.C. now, and you told me earlier this morning that you actually saw a large part of the crash recovery effort take place. Tell us about that. Tell us about what you saw. What's it like there in Washington?
Yeah, James, the Bondi Partners office is right on the river in Washington, D.C., and I was working in the office last night at the time of the crash. Let me make it clear: I did not see the collision, but almost immediately after the collision, the sirens started, and what you saw right then was one of the largest emergency responses probably here since 9/11. It's not exaggeration to say there were more than 100 emergency response vehicles on the road. You could see them from literally miles away on both sides of the river. The airport in Washington, D.C. sits just on the west side of the river that goes right through Washington, D.C. So they had emergency response vehicles on both sides. They had boats in the water. They had helicopters in the air. All of this within easily 20 minutes of the actual accident itself.
And look, I know it's very, very early days, and we're going to have to let the NTSB and the FAA investigating precisely what happened here. But this airspace over the Potomac River, where National Airport sits, Reagan Airport sits on the other side from Washington, D.C., I know it well. I went to school in Washington. I lived there for years. This is some very crowded airspace, isn't it?
Oh, it's some of the most crowded airspace in the country. It's also some of the most restricted airspace in the country. Keep in mind, you're not allowed to fly over the White House. You're not allowed to fly over the Capitol. So it's a very tight airspace. That being said, James, it's like that every single night. And the place usually operates wonderfully. I mean, look, we haven't had an accident in this country since 2000, a fatal accident in this whole country since 2009, and there hasn't been a fatal accident in Washington, D.C., I think, since 1984. So the folks who run the place know how to do this, and I think that's going to be one of the focus of the investigation is that why, on a clear night, and no storms, no clouds, did this accident take place? Attention is turning immediately to the staffing of the FAA tower, which typically has two people, one to handle the commercial aviation and one to handle military helicopters, was only staffed by one person. I'm sure that will get some attention. But again, we're in the very early days of the investigation, and everyone's waiting to see what we do learn.
Yeah, look, I mean, again, we can't really speculate. There's a lot of lines of inquiry. Did the Black Hawk pilot have some night vision goggles that might have obscured his field of vision? There's lots of things we're going to wind up hearing about, and we'll find out, when we get those results. But in the meantime, this crisis has become very political almost immediately. And as I was saying earlier in the program, this is basically the first crisis that the Trump administration has had to handle. It immediately became political with these charges from the left that he'd left the FAA unstaffed, on the right from Trump and others that this was a diversity problem. How do you think Donald Trump has handled this first major crisis of his administration 2.0?
I'm not a big fan of playing the DEI card right away unless you have some sort of evidence to that effect. I like making arguments based on evidence. The left's attack on the lack of an FAA director is similarly outrageous. It was actually under the Biden administration that the gentleman left, but it doesn't make any difference. The FAA administrator isn't the person who's out in the tower and so forth. I thought the person who really stood out as being exemplary in the way he's handled this was Sean Duffy, a name your folks probably won't recognize. He is the newly sworn-in Secretary of Transportation, a former colleague of mine in the House. This is his third day at work, or yesterday was his third day at work. And so you can only imagine having to deal with the first fatality on American soil in 16 years is quite overwhelming. But I think all in all, the response has been good. It has been level. Again, I don't approve of the DEI stuff, but again, I'm not the president of the United States, and I don't approve of blaming Donald Trump for something that clearly wasn't his fault. But you're right. Everything is politicized in this country these days, and this is no exception.
Yeah, it's a real shame. Hey, while I've got you, Mick, I want to talk about some of these confirmation hearings that we've had in the last 12, 24 hours for Kash Patel and Tulsi Gabbard. Some fiery scenes up there on Capitol Hill. What did you make of these two, and do you think they'll get through?
I got to think, James, I'll take your second question first. I got to think that one of them, the three this week, were Bobby Kennedy, Kash Patel, and Tulsi Gabbard. And my gut is that one of them won't make it. Why? Because I think the Republicans in the Senate really want to sort of flex their muscles, their institutional muscles, and send the message down to Donald Trump that as much as they support him, they're not a rubber stamp. Personally, I think Bobby Kennedy is going to have the hardest time of it because he's got the weakest connection with Donald Trump. Kash Patel is one of Trump's favorites. There's no question. I think Kash probably gets through, and he performed extraordinarily well today. Tulsi Gabbard, newer to the Trump world, but still a stronger connection than Bobby Kennedy, and she's done very well. What you've seen in these hearings, especially this week, but across the board, James, much more assertive defenses of the Trump agenda than we had even back in 2017. I think I told you when I was nominated in 2017 and went through this same process to be in the cabinet, I was told to simply grin and bear it and not fight back. Just simply sit there, say yes, sir, to every senator, yes, ma'am, to everybody who attacks you, and then try and get the vote. So clearly it's a different memo this year, and you saw that aggressiveness, that assertiveness, that not backing down sort of mentality from the hearings this week.
Well, Mick, it's really fascinating. I'd love to get your take on this because when you faced that questioning in 2017, it feels like today in 2025, the quality of Senate queries, of the rhetoric of the debate in the Senate in that hearing room has really gone downhill. A lot of the Senate lines of questioning, it's just been grandstanding, speech making, illogical points, and just making sure people sign up to a certain set of talking points rather than actual real interrogation of beliefs. Has the quality of the Senate gone down? It feels kind of like it hasn't been setting its best to these hearings.
Oh, James, that's a loaded question to a former member of the House. Of course, I think the Senate is a complete waste of time. No, and they're pompous and asking meaningless questions. But more seriously, look, so often, to get down in the weeds, so often in the first Trump administration, we would go to Mitch McConnell and say, we need to do X, Y, Z. And he would say, well, we just don't have enough time to do that in the Senate. Time is very valuable in the Senate, and we don't have time to do that. They've spent their time this week, for example, talking to Pete Hegseth about drinking at a Christmas party in 2014. It's just absurd. Advise and consent, which is the clause in our Constitution that gives the Senate the right to approve these sorts of nominees, has really become a question of extort and delay. And there's a great deal of showboating. There's a lot of Democrats, by the way, James, this week, to your point, who didn't even ask a question. Sheldon Whitehouse did ask a question twice of Bobby Kennedy, by the way, who's his law school roommate, I learned this week. He talked for 5 minutes 2 times and didn't ask a question. He was simply trying to get content for his own social media page. So, yeah, do I think Senate confirmation needs to be severely reformed? Yes, I do. I think it's gotten out of hand. But that's a longer discussion for another day. Right now, the Trump team just wants to get through the confirmation process.
Mick Mulvaney, I look forward to having that and many other conversations with you in the future. Thanks so much for joining me on the U.S. Report.
Thanks, James.